Hello friends, Carlos Alberto the Thinker here. Welcome back to the channel. If you watched the previous video about El Helicoide, that short 7-minute clip that serves as a perfect introduction to the topic, you already know the extraordinary and painful journey of this iconic building in Caracas, how it began as a futuristic dream in the 1950s, the ultimate symbol of Venezuelan oil progress and a modernity that seemed unstoppable, and how it ended up transformed into SEBIN's most feared and darkest prison, a place associated with international reports of torture, arbitrary detentions, and systematic human rights violations. Today, we're revisiting the topic because the story hasn't stopped for a moment. We're in the middle of February 2026, and there's important new information worth calmly analyzing. The official announcement of its closure, the announced redevelopment plan, the ongoing protests in the streets, the intensified debate on social media and in the news, and most importantly, at the end of the video, my personal proposal as a Stoic thinker to resolve this swinging polarization in a balanced, responsible, constructive, and above all dignified way for all Venezuelans. So, stick around until the end, because I truly believe this idea could represent a different path, one that doesn't choose between the extremes of turning everything into a museum or erasing everything as if nothing happened. Let's take it step by step. First, let's go back in detail and without rushing to what El Helicoide was meant to be from its original design, because understanding this is key to appreciating why my proposal aims to revive that lost dream. We're talking about the year 1955, in the heart of the Venezuelan oil boom, under the government of Marcos Pérez Jiménez. Venezuela was one of the richest countries in the world thanks to oil, and that wealth translated into an ambition for modernity. 3 visionary architects, Pedro Neuberger, Jorge Romero Gutierrez, and Dirk Bornhorst, were given the task of creating something that wasn't just a building, but a symbol of that prosperous and cosmopolitan Venezuela we all dreamed of. This wasn't a typical shopping mall like those found in other parts of the world. It was something much bolder, the first real drive-through shopping center in the history of the planet. Imagine the innovation, helical ramps over 4 kilometers long that allowed cars to go up and down in a continuous spiral, stopping directly in front of the store or establishment the customer wanted to visit without needing to get out of the car if they didn't want to. It was the freedom of the automobile taken to the extreme, modern consumption at your fingertips, progress materialized in concrete and steel. The project included between 300 and 320 high-end commercial stores, lined along this ascending and descending spiral. But it didn't stop there. It included 8 state-of-the-art movie theaters, a 5-star hotel with spectacular views, an exclusive private club for the oil elite, an entertainment and conference palace covered by a geodesic dome inspired by Buckminster Fuller's ideas, a helipad on top for executives arriving by helicopter from the oil fields, art galleries where even Master Salvador Dalí offered to collaborate on the decoration, a television studio to broadcast live events, a playground for children, and even a permanent industrial exhibition designed to show the entire world the power of Venezuelan oil and the country's industrial capacity. All of this harmoniously integrated into Roca Tapia, with Austrian elevators specially made for the project and spectacular landscaping designed by the renowned Roberto Burle Marx. It was the ultimate symbol of a Venezuela that saw itself as a regional leader, modern, prosperous, open to the future. The building was exhibited at the Museum of Modern Art in New York in 1961 and generated international admiration. But political history took a dramatic turn. The fall of Pérez Jiménez in January 1958 accumulated financial problems, and the instability that followed meant the project was never inaugurated. The physical structure remained there, intact, waiting for a destiny that never arrived in its original form. And that destiny ended up being cruel and unexpected. Instead of becoming a place of gathering, commerce, and prosperity for Venezuelans, its initial abandonment turned it into a progressive ruin, and later, the main headquarters of SEBIN, the Bolivarian intelligence service. For years and decades, it was synonymous with arbitrary detention, brutal interrogations, physical and psychological torture, and systematic human rights violations. International organizations like the UN, through its reports on Venezuela, Amnesty International, Human Rights Watch, and the Venezuelan Penal Forum, have documented in detail cases of political prisoners, temporary forced disappearances, beatings in cells, inhumane detention conditions, and torture methods that violate all international conventions. Particularly important is the 2019 report by the then UN High Commissioner for Human Rights, Michelle Bachelet, former president of Chile and a figure of the democratic left. Bachelet, after visiting Venezuela and interviewing hundreds of victims, explicitly denounced torture and inhumane treatment in centers like El Helicoide, including pressure on detained women for sexual relations in exchange for favors, prolonged isolation, mock executions, and physical violence. Her team lost access to El Helicoide and other SEBIN centers. This prevented subsequent independent monitoring. Bachelet's reports, a progressive voice not aligned with the right, remain a mandatory reference for understanding that the denunciations are not opposition propaganda, but facts documented by multilateral organizations. The same building that represented the dreamed future transformed into one of the darkest and most feared places of the Venezuelan present. This is the Pendulum in its rawest form, a meteoric rise driven by oil wealth, followed by a brutal, prolonged and painful fall that affected thousands of families. Now, let's focus on what's happening exactly in February 2026. On January 30th of this year, Acting President Delcy Rodríguez announced a general amnesty for political prisoners and the definitive closure of El Helicoide as a prison, fulfilling an express order from Donald Trump, who seems to have set a deadline for her to do so as part of his policy of pressure on the Venezuelan regime. In turn, the regime presented a plan to convert it into a social, sports, cultural, and commercial center with an emphasis on serving local communities and especially the families of police officers. The official message is clear: transform a place associated with pain and repression into a positive space for gathering, sports, for young people, cultural activities, and everyday commerce that generates employment and well-being. Many interpret this as a genuine gesture of national healing, closing the dark chapter and returning the building to the people for constructive uses. But the reality on the ground is not so simple or straightforward. As of this moment, February 2026, there is no concrete and firm date for the total closure of operations as a prison. Releases have progressed partially, selectively, and have not covered all political prisoners that independent organizations like Foro Penal and Provea continue to report. The families of the detainees continue with sustained protests in Zone 7 and other areas, demanding immediate and total release, transparency in processes, and guarantees that there will be no reprisals. Furthermore, criticism from the opposition, human rights activists, and a large part of the Venezuelan diaspora is growing stronger. Is this a real and structural closure or just a symbolic cover-up? And there's a particularly sensitive point. The fact that the redevelopment plan prioritizes the families of police officers generates discomfort and rejection from the other side, precisely because of this sector's historical link to El Helicoide's repressive and stormy past. Is this a gesture of reconciliation or a reinforcement of power? Is there an attempt to erase the physical and symbolic memory of what happened there so that no visible trace of the horror remains? Is it a cosmetic measure to improve the international image without addressing the roots of the problem? And here, it's important to remember that denunciations like Bachelet's in 2019 remain valid in subsequent UN reports. Limited or no access to centers like El Helicoide has prevented independent verification, which fuels doubts about whether the announced closure will truly end the abuses or merely change their form. This is where the debate becomes deeply and emotionally polarized. On one hand, the stance of many opponents, activists, and human rights defenders is forceful. El Helicoide must become a complete museum dedicated exclusively to memory. They argue that preserving the entire building as a living testament to systematic violations is a moral obligation. It is necessary to honor the victims who passed through there, to educate new generations about what can happen when power runs wild, and to send a clear message that this type of abuse must never be repeated. They say that any commercial, sports, or social use that does not prioritize memory would be a direct betrayal of those who suffered torture, isolation, and loss of freedom. This is a perfectly understandable position. Historical memory is a form of justice, and forgetting or diluting the past is dangerous for any society that aspires not to repeat mistakes. On the other hand, the government and the sectors supporting the redevelopment present a different argument, but equally valid in its logic. Keeping El Helicoide as a perpetual prison or an exclusive museum would keep the country trapped in eternal suffering. They propose a social, sports, cultural, and commercial center that generates jobs for the community, sports spaces for young people to prevent crime, cultural activities that foster national identity, and a commercial area that boosts the local economy. They say that this is how true healing happens, transforming horror into something useful and positive for the people, closing the dark cycle and looking forward. This is also a stance that carries weight. Progress cannot be frozen in pain forever. People need spaces for daily life, not just reminders of suffering. Both sides have deep and understandable reasons, but neither fully solves the problem. One risks freezing the building in eternal suffering, turning it into a monument to pain that could create more division than healing. The other risks erasing or diluting collective memory, causing new generations to grow up without fully understanding what happened there and why it shouldn't be repeated. So, after much reflection on this historical pendulum, as the Stoic thinker I am, I want to share my personal proposal, one that I believe balances memory and progress, justice and the future. Stoic philosophy teaches us something fundamental: to accept reality as it is, without denying or distorting it. The past of El Helicoide cannot be changed. What happened was serious, painful, and unjust, and denying it would be disrespectful to the victims. But clinging exclusively to pain also traps us in suffering and prevents us from moving forward. Stoic virtue lies in using what already exists, what life has given us, even with its scars, for the common good, without denying the truth, but without being trapped by resentment. Therefore, my proposal is this: that El Helicoide return to the origin of its creation, to what it wanted to be and could not be for political and economic reasons, an iconic modern visionary commercial center which today could become one of the best in the world. With its unique helical ramps over 4 kilometers long, allowing continuous spiral circulation with impressive panoramic views of Caracas and the city, futuristic design that still surprises today with its boldness and integration with the Roca Tapaya Hill, enormous potential for premium national and international stores, food courts that celebrate Venezuelan and global cuisine, cultural spaces for exhibitions and events, integrated sports areas, sustainability with solar panels on the ramps and green roofs, a global tourist attraction comparable to icons like the Guggenheim Bilbao or Marina Bay Sands in Singapore. Let's imagine a shopping center that not only sells products, but is a living symbol of recovered prosperity, of meeting between Venezuelans of all classes, of renewed national pride, and a possible future. To return to the people a place of daily life, dignified employment, dynamic commerce, and collective celebration. But that's not all. And here comes something absolutely essential for the proposal to be fair and responsible. At least one entire floor, a whole level of the building, should be reserved as a permanent memorial museum dedicated exclusively to memory. On that floor, everything that happened would be rigorously and sensitively documented, recorded and written testimonies of victims and their families, historical photographs from its time as a prison, digital and physical reconstructions of cells and interrogation areas, complete reports from the UN, Amnesty International, and Foro Penal, explanatory panels about political prisoners, reported torture methods, and the political context that allowed this to happen. The entire building would not be turned into a museum because we don't want to freeze it in horror or prevent it from fulfilling its original function of progress and gathering. But there would be a sufficient visible and well-designed space so that no one forgets, so that future generations, including children and young people, understand what happened there, why it was serious, and why it must never happen again. This way, we honor memory responsibly and deeply, without letting resentment dominate the present. Progress without historical amnesia, justice without perpetual revenge, dignity for the victims and for the entire country. The Venezuelan pendulum has swung widely between grand dreams and deep nightmares. Perhaps the historical moment is, finally, to swing it upwards with balance, wisdom, and respect for all who have suffered. What do you think? Does my Stoic proposal seem viable and fair? Do you prefer a total museum that preserves the entire building as an eternal testimony, or a pure redevelopment without a dedicated space for memory? Or do you believe that this middle path, reviving the original dream of the iconic commercial center, but with an entire floor reserved for the Memorial Museum, could be the balance Venezuela needs? Leave your opinions in the comments. I read all of them carefully, especially the greetings and messages from Venezuela that move me so much and motivate me to continue delving into these topics. If this analysis was helpful or made you think, leave a like, subscribe to the channel, and hit the bell to not miss more reflections on the historical pendulum of our total America. Thank you from the bottom of my heart for being here and for joining me on this journey. See you in the next video.